The Cuyahoga County Finance and Budgeting Committee meeting for Monday, June 12, 2023 is called to order, and the clerk will please call the roll.
And just as a reminder to all who are in attendance, this meeting is being recorded and live streamed on the county's YouTube page. Calling the roll, Mr. Miller,
Here.
Mr. Tillman,
Here.
Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones is absent at the moment. Mr. Gallagher, Mr. Shrine, Mr. Kelly is absent. Ms. Turner is absent at the moment. There is a quorum. Also like the record to reflect that Councilwoman Conway was in attendance.
Thank you very much. And the next item on the agenda is public comment. Do we have anybody signed in?
No, Mr. Chair, no one is signed in.
And item number 4 is approval of the minutes from the June 5th, 2023 meeting. Do we have a motion relative to
I'll
those
make that motion.
minutes? It's been moved and seconded to approve the minutes from June 5th, 2023. Any discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed say no. The ayes have it, and the motion is approved. And item number 5 is matters referred to committee. Resolution 2023-0156.
Resolution number 2023-0156, amending the 2022-2023 biennial operating budget for 2023 by providing for additional fiscal appropriations from the general fund and other funding sources for appropriation transfers between budget accounts and for cash transfers between budgetary funds to meet the budgetary needs of various county departments, offices, and agencies.
Thank you very much. And in requesting a Finance and Budget Committee hearing on the $3.17 million proposed appropriation for the August 8th special election, we do not question the actions of either the administration or the election board. They merely perform their duties. However, in my opinion, the decision to hold the August 8th special election is one of the biggest boondoggles in the history of the state of Ohio. First, the decision was made only months after the legislature wisely decided to ban August special elections, except in cases of financial emergency due to high expense and low voter turnout, and they're quickly going in the opposite direction. Second, the election is being held to vote on a single issue which changes election rules in the middle of the game and would drastically reduce the power of the people to democratically propose and enact desired constitutional amendments. And finally, and most outrageous of all, the decision was made with no provision on how to pay for it, leaving counties and or municipalities potentially having to shoulder the cost. The current Senate version of the state budget recently included $15 million for the special election, but we do not know whether this item will make the final version or whether it is sufficient. We hope to have State Representative Bride Sweeney with us shortly to provide additional light on these questions. In the meantime, I now call on Director Parfiowicz, followed by Election Board Director Tony Perlotti to provide their insight on this item.
Good afternoon, council members. As presented on the fiscal agenda, we have an item here for roughly $3.2 million for the August 8th special primary election. We may or may not be reimbursed for this, as you stated. With that, I'll leave it with Director Perlotti to take it to the next step.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. So, as the director said, we're asking for almost $3.16 million. We come up with that dollar amount based on a per precinct basis. So in 2022, the Secretary of State's office required all boards of elections, and typically they would do this on an annual basis, to calculate what it costs to conduct an election on a precinct basis. There's a formula that we follow based on certain costs such as printing of ballots, poll worker wages, temporary employee wages, postage, other contracts that we have to conduct the election. And going through that process, that formula in Cuyahoga County, it's about $3,250 per precinct to conduct an election. We have 975 precincts at the time of this request. You do that math problem and it comes out to the $3.16 million, and that's how we come up with that dollar amount. This election was created out of Senate Joint Resolution number 2, so that's why we have to do this. We don't have an option. But as Council Member Miller said, $15 million at this point has been put into the budget for that. Some of us in the election world and in county commissioner, county council type environments have been lobbying, saying that that is not enough based on this formula that the Secretary of State makes us do. I am one of those individuals. I have gotten some time with reporters and things like that, and it seems like the legislature is looking to increase the funding amount, and there's a couple things that they're looking to do. One is from last year when we had the elections in May and in August, which weren't under normal conditions as far as tight time frames, and that and an August election that really wasn't was the first time that you had a primary like that. There was additional funding that was put forth, and not all of that was expended. There's about $6 million left over from 2022 that potentially that could be applied. There's talks in Columbus of that money putting towards that. But also, there is, in the revised code, section 3501.17F, and it says when a precinct is open during a special election solely for the purpose of submitting to the voters a statewide ballot issue, the state shall bear the entire cost of the election in that precinct and shall reimburse the county for all expenses incurred for that precinct. So that's something that the Secretary of State this past Friday, June 9th, I think reminded the legislature of that there is this responsibility for this to happen. And my understanding also is then now some of the conversation in Columbus is, do we allow this $15 million, and hopefully it does stay in and it gets passed, expend those dollars, and then if it's not enough, the Secretary of State, through whatever the Board of Control is at the state level, would ask for an additional amount to cover those expenses, or potentially take the $6 million left over and tack that on and just put that there and send the money to the boards now. What we don't have is a real answer on how that's going to happen, but at least from the time in which we reached out for this request and now, there has been some movement in Columbus where we do hear about a $15 million number and the potential for some more. But the mechanism and how that will work, again, if Representative Sweeney comes, she definitely would have probably more insights into that process. So, so the number is not a made-up number. It's based off of a Secretary of State formula that all 88 counties have to calculate. That's what we did. That's what we're asking for. Last year when we had the election, it cost us about $2 million, so that's $1 million less than where we are. So we don't, again, we base it off of this formula, but I think some of the things that'll be different in 23 than 22 is the August of 22 was a not well-attended election. It was somewhere around 8%, and I believe that this will exceed that. We don't have good comparables, so we're kind of looking to anywhere from last year, around 8%, up to what the gubernatorial general election would be at about 50%. It is, the question on the ballot is something that people are passionate about, and somewhere in that range, this will happen. And how that impacts the dollar amount is printing of ballots, postage, vote by mail. If that goes up, those are costs, then that will be higher. Our poll worker wages, we tried to have 2 to 3 poll workers per precinct last year. We're trying to have 3 to 4 this year, again, in anticipation potentially of higher turnout. And in Cuyahoga County, we are rolling out new voting equipment. So this August will be the first election in which we used it. If you remember, I was here during budget time kind of talking about that. And so we do want to make sure that we're sufficiently staffed with we always want to be sufficiently staffed with poll workers, but be more towards the 4 per precinct that code wants you to have because of the new equipment. And if just getting more familiar with it. So then this way, when November comes, it'll be the second time that they're touching the equipment. And then also, find out now if people are uncomfortable with the equipment, meaning the poll workers, and they don't want to come back in November. Well, we know that information now, so we can put higher recruitment efforts in to make sure that we're fully staffed for what will be a well-attended November election this year. And we also, our temporary employee costs are higher. We were going to implement the new equipment in September, which that deadline is this Wednesday. We know that that'll be a small election. And so we were going to implement then. Now doing in August, we had a month cut off of our schedule, which means we now, in a month in election world is like a lifetime. So now we have to figure out how to train everyone and actually create a ballot, which we don't know how to do yet in the system, but we should by week's end. So it's just more time and resources to get everything prepared, redoing all of our training materials, all things that we would have done, but now we're doing it on an expedited schedule to meet the new timelines. So, and that's part of those wages that built into that $3,250 per precinct.
Okay, thank you very much. I have some questions, but I'm going to turn it to my colleagues first, and Councilman Gallagher's first one that I saw.
Director, historically, I don't know if you've looked at this, has there ever been a time where such a mandate's come on what do we call this? Is this a midterm election or off?
This is it's a special primary.
A special primary. Historically, in the state of Ohio, has the counties not been reimbursed?
We haven't had a special primary like this that wasn't part of either a May or a November election, so we don't really have a good comparable for this. So we do have last August, which was a special primary election for those, and through that process, we did get funded. We got $1.5 million up front, and then we had a fight for the remaining $500,000, and we eventually did get that by year end to cover the cost. But the initial appropriation of 1.5 was what the state thought would be sufficient for us to do what we needed to do, and it wasn't.
So that one cost $2 million. So now they know what the cost is and it was an 8% turnout?
I think it was an 8% turnout.
8% turnout. So they gave us less money than that one?
So right now, I think it cost around $15 million for last year's. So I think they're appropriating it at about what it was last year for an 8% turnout.
No, just our county, just our county.
Oh, our county? They haven't given us anything yet.
But I'm saying if they were, they're not giving us the $3 million.
I would assume that would be correct.
As we sit here today.
If they use the same funding logic that they did last time to appropriate the money, I would assume we would get $1.5 million again.
Okay, thank you.
Councilman Tron.
Struggling to follow your math. Last year, same August timeframe, fairly low turnout, but that you have to prepare as though you don't really know what the turnout's going to be, I assume, don't you?
So you project what you think your turnout's going to be.
Yeah.
And we would look to what the May election was. So for our ballot printing and our vote by mail, we came with a low number because those primaries are typically low turnout.
Okay.
And a lot of.
So what are you predicting this percentage is going to be?
So we're going to top end 50%.
You think there's going to be 50% of the people voting in an August election?
For this question, there could be.
Oh.
We don't know. I mean, there's a lot of people passionate about it. I know Cuyahoga County is leading the state in petition signatures for the question to be on November. And I think those same efforts that are going into getting people to sign the petitions will go into turning out the vote in August because it's directly related to the November election.
Wow. See, I would be shocked to get to 50%. I mean, have you ever seen an August election get to 50%?
So last year, that primary, that countywide, that was the first primary ever like that. We don't have August countywide. This is so unique. So this is where we don't have good historical data, where you have an August countywide election on a statewide issue. I can't even point to when this had last happened, because those issues happen either in May or November. And typically our August election will be, it's nothing to do statewide. It is a school district coming forward trying to get a levy, so it's
right.
so there's not good comparables. So to the one part is you have to prepare, and so we're preparing for a high end of 50. I don't know if necessarily if it'll get there, but I don't want to get caught off
What's the
guard.
presidential election get to?
70, 72,
Okay, and what's the gubernatorial election?
50.
Okay, so you're saying this is going to be every bit as high as the gubernatorial election in August?
Could be.
Wow, okay.
I really don't, it's a guess. There's not a good comparable. We want to be at least prepared for that, though. And again, I think it's because there's going to be, and typically in August, you wouldn't have funds put in by campaigns and organizations to advertise, like school levies and that, but we know there is money on both sides for the yes and no votes behind this. And I think we will see yard signs, we'll see TV advertising, we'll see all those things. But
What's a May statewide run? What percent?
it depends it depends if it's a gubernatorial or a presidential. It's not as high. It's not 50%.
No, it's only in the 30s, 20 to 30s.
Yeah.
I'm just shocked that you think this is going to be bigger than a presidential primary or bigger than a gubernatorial primary that would be statewide in a May timeframe, which I would think historically May is a better month to get voters to turn out than in August.
Well, and I think, one of the difference between this issue and, say, some of the candidates is a lot of times, I mean, oftentimes you have an incumbent. So when we have our primaries in May, you have one party that has, whether it's depending on what cycle it is, you'll have one party that'll have a competitive primary. And so that side comes out, and then the other party not so much. So like for, next year, potentially you would have really
There'll be no incumbents next time.
What's that?
There'll be no incumbents next time. They're all going to be running. So, I mean, you only have incumbents every other cycle on the gubernatorial, at the most.
Right.
Yeah.
But like last cycle, we didn't. Right. I mean, it wasn't like, even though Governor DeWine had competition, he was still running as an incumbent. But you're right. So next time, there will
You
be
can do the
no
math.
incumbent.
It's only, they can only be there for 8 years.
For 8 years.
Every other election, there's not going to be an incumbent. Okay, thanks.
Ms. Conwell.
Through the chair to the director, so if you prepare for a 50% turnout and say you only have about 10%, what will the dollar loss be?
Well, you pre-print your ballots, so you have that cost that's not reimbursable. The vote by mail, if it's a lower turnout, we're producing vote by mail on an ongoing basis, on a daily basis. So that we will only get billed for what is utilized. So that there you're paying real costs for that. So really, a lot of it is it's your election day ballot order.
So the 15 million you threw out was for the whole cost for the state of Ohio, tentatively?
15 million, yes,
15.
that's what the Senate had put out.
So our 3 million, maybe, is what we'd need for Cuyahoga County?
Correct.
And then out of that 3 million, I'll switch to another for that train of thought left. Why not a general election? Was that a question that you asked? Why wouldn't we do this during the general election instead of having a special election?
Why did the legislature not do it on?
Yeah,
There has been a ton of debate
okay.
in Columbus as to the timing of this to happen. The Ohio Association of Election Officials, a nonprofit organization in which Cuyahoga County is a member of, we lobbied to not have the August election. We didn't say when to put the question on. We just said you shouldn't have an August election since it was just removed through House Bill 458, and now it's been placed back on. So that was the voice that election officials, our official voice, putting that forward.
And Director, when you came out here before to talk about the new voting equipment, I don't know, a few months ago, did you know at that time or that we would be using those new voting equipment during that time? I thought maybe you said November
No.
would be the first time.
The September primary would be the first time because this, you wouldn't have this election at that point in time during the budget hearings and we were going through that process, or the recommendation for the purchase. There wasn't an August statewide election established.
But when you came out here to talk to us, I'm trying to remember, you thought that the first time we would use it, I remember you said it wouldn't be November.
Right, it would be September.
It would be September. So why not this in September?
We can't. You can't have, when August came into play, we have to implement in August. So we don't have the space to house two complete voting systems and run one in August and then another in September, and then coding the old with that and learning the new. So it's all effort now goes into having this equipment ready for use for August.
And just correct me if I'm wrong through the chair. You stated when you mentioned the ORC codes, we cannot, based on the codes, we as a county cannot say we don't want to move forward with this election.
Well, the revised code that I said, that's language that deals with funding, who needs to fund it. But there was, it was amended substitute Senate Joint Resolution number 2, that legislation is what says that the question will be called at an August 8th election.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, I'm now going to call forward State Representative Bride Sweeney. We greatly appreciate your being with us today. Yes, please.
Okay.
Oh, you don't have, I'd like you to stay in the audience, but you don't have, we may call you back. Okay. And we really appreciate your being with us today, and we're particularly interested in any information you can provide us as to what the prospects are of the $15 million funding being approved in the budget bill, and also what evidence you have on whether that number is adequate to conduct the election.
Yes, well, thank you, Chairman and members of the committee, for inviting me to speak today. I am the ranking member of the Finance Committee down in Columbus that we are currently overseeing our state operating budget, which does have the allocation in question. That just the Senate subbill was just released a few weeks ago, and we're looking at going to a conference committee by next week to kind of hash out the differences between the House and the Senate. When the House had its version of the budget, we did not actually have this special election, this question before us. And so the $15 million appeared in the Senate version, as was just discussed. I have grave concerns about the $15 million and it not being enough. And as Director Perlotti had just indicated, there is code section that actually requires the state to reimburse all counties when it is the legislature's decision to have an election. However, I have watched time and time again my colleagues ignore, Supreme Court cases and other decisions. And I think it's really important that we're having this discussion and keep the pressure on. In terms of, we are hoping and expecting higher turnout. We have not had an August election statewide like this in modern history. I personally, and on behalf of my constituents, find the fact that we would waste millions of taxpayer dollars, continue to stretch our election officials who, I'm just so proud of the work that Director Perlotti has done. But we had a absurd August election last year that cost our taxpayers money, time, when we had 8% turnout. And when you look and compare many precincts across the state had absolutely no competition on that election, and we only had 8% turnout. And there's a reason why my colleagues, and it's not conjecture, the sponsor of HR 1 and also our Secretary of State has made it abundantly clear as to why they've put forward a special election to cost taxpayer $15-20 million. That is to prevent the reproductive justice ballot initiative in November. And so a lot of people on both sides of
Call this witness up to talk about the finances.
Oh.
Now going off
I apologize. I was giving the context of the question of.
You're giving your political point of view. You were called up to talk about the financing.
Sure, and I'm happy to talk about the financing.
Please proceed. We should know the context of the election.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I think it's important that a lot of our Board of Elections across the state, when they've come in to testify as to why they think that the $15 million is not sufficient, is because that people are looking at this August election as a precursor for the November question, and that the same amount of money and interest on both sides of this issue from, I have seen fundraising numbers of $10 million of people that are going to raise awareness about this August election, and that we need to be prepared, because if our boards of elections are going with the last August election at 8%, I mean, you have to take into account the amount of ballots you need to be prepared. If we have an influx, especially with the new voting ID requirements that we just went through in May, we could see a really surge of vote by mail ballots because you don't have that same requirement. And if our boards of elections do not put forward and expect and have to prepare for a larger election, given we do not have history and given the nature of how people are perceiving this August election, and I think we should all want, regardless of what is on the ballot, people to be engaged and to participate. And so we hope that we have large turnout, and we should expect to have so. I would say that in terms of the timeline, we have to have a constitutionally passed budget in the state by June 30th. And so that is when we know the final question in the determinants. I have been at least hopeful with our Senate president, who, after the election officials and many outcrying of only allowing to have $15 million put forward, knowing that in the estimates, and I've reached out to the Legislative Service Commission, which is our nonpartisan body that actually puts forward, it quite possibly can be up to $20 million. And so we, and, in my perspective, who will be sitting on the conference committee, hashing out the differences on the conference committee, will continue to push forward. And I also sit on the state controlling board. If the fact that we do not appropriate enough, the Secretary of State could come before us, and as Director Perlotti had indicated, to ask for more. There's another point I think that's relevant for people to know, is that there are multiple pending lawsuits over the legality of having an August election. And so in the middle of lame duck last General Assembly, I think in November or December, the General Assembly majority actually went forward with, as we talked about, eliminating the ability for the state to have special elections. by the sponsors and our Secretary of State, calling them a way to sneak on certain issues. And it's when you actually look at the cost benefit, it can be very expensive to our taxpayers to put forward. And so the majority of my colleagues put that forward. There was Senate Bill 92 that actually has not become law and has failed in committee, and that bill was separate than SJR 2, which is the resolution that actually put that issue before the voters. Senate Bill 92 actually would create a special election and had a $20 million appropriation that was put forward by 2 Republicans in the Senate to actually go in conjunction. That bill did not become law, and so there is a current pending litigation about whether or not you can add a special election in a resolution without legislative action of a bill. And so that is still ongoing. We do not know the certain time frame. We know that military voting starts June 23rd, and we would hope that we'd have a decision either way, for or against, so that, worst case scenarios at boards of elections, you have to prepare. We have to go forward as if we are having an election. And so, there could be the worst case scenario, or I would love for it to be canceled, but that our boards of elections are putting forward and making orders for ballots that then can be canceled. And so I just think that's relevant information. There was another lawsuit that was challenging the actual ballot language that actually I think got just released an hour ago, so I've not had full time to review that, but it does look like they're going to make some changes to what the actual language says on the 5%. But that did not give an outcome of whether or not we're going to have an election. And so as we sit here today, just to summarize, we are looking at, a legal question of whether or not this is illegal and what kind of cost is that to our taxpayers. And I think it's a very good sign that we do have $15 million in the budget. But again, that will not be decided to at least June 30th. This is public knowledge as well. We've had both the Senate President and the Speaker of the House question whether or not we'd actually meet that deadline. And so we quite literally could have continuing resolutions on the state when we're talking about coming to agreement on the budget. And so this could be an outstanding question, but, I'm at least appreciative that we do have bipartisan support and have had encouraging remarks that if it is not enough money, that we will go forward, because I think we should all hope and encourage our constituents to participate in our elections, and we, I think, have to be prepared for a high turnout given the nature of what we are talking about. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
So if the courts ruled against the election, but did so quite late, and the election boards had already spent money to prepare for the election, would the money they spent be reimbursable?
That would be a question. My hope would that be, it would be, I would absolutely fight and encourage my colleagues in Columbus to do so, given the fact that this is completely the decision of, the legislatures in Columbus to have incurred those expenses. Again, there is no definitive deadline. In past practices, courts, once an election starts, they don't like to, stop an election going forward. So hopefully we could have a decision, but it is possible that we start voting and we do get a ruling that would say that this is an illegal election and you have to move it to November or just eliminate altogether. So it's a question, but because we do have that code that says if you have an election, but it doesn't spell out if you have an election, then it gets canceled, that the state of Ohio would reimburse. But it would be my intent to push to make sure that the county's not out any money because of the decision of the state legislature.
So since you say they're not inclined to cancel an election that's already in progress, you would expect if they're going to make a decision to cancel, they probably would do it by the end of the month. Would that be a fair statement?
Yes, and I want to be very transparent. I am not a lawyer, but talking to some lawyers, that is my interpretation. But there is, it could happen after the fact, but practice has gone that, given the nature of elections, that we would hope, and obviously the judge's ruling on that would take into consideration the timing of that election. So again, I believe, and Director Bellotti can correct me if I'm wrong, if military votes, which are the first individuals to receive their ballots overseas, starts June 23rd, best case scenario, I think just, for our election officials, the people of Ohio, that we should know either way if this is a legal election. And my hope would be that we would know before those ballots go out. But I was just on the phone with our legal counsel who indicated practice would indicate we'd know before, but it could happen while ballots are out and they would be thrown away after the fact. But it's up to the judges, so.
And do you consider the fact that Senate Bill 92 contained $20 million as pretty strong evidence that at least that much is probably needed?
Absolutely, Chairman. Again, that Senate Bill 92 was a bill that was brought up by 2 Republicans in the Senate that did pass the Senate and is still pending the Government Oversight Committee. It was my understanding that there was not enough votes to get that out. And so in that time at $20 million, I think that's the bare minimum, and we cannot compare the last August election to this one, given, as I stated, you had actually the vast majority, it was only legislative seats that were on that August election. The vast majority of them, you didn't have primaries, and I think the people of Ohio, even candidates running, we only knew about the election six weeks beforehand. Given that this is a statewide election that will impact every single precinct, every single individual in Ohio, we absolutely, I don't think, can do the bare minimum, which last time around it was a reimbursement about $15 million.
Okay, thank you. And before opening it up to questions from my colleagues, we're going to call back the director for a moment, and we'll call you back momentarily.
Okay.
I understand you're on a tight schedule, so I have one further question, and I'm gonna see if any other colleagues have any other questions for you, so that you can go. The question I have is if you could elaborate more on this. It sounded like you said that if you print a lot of election day ballots, anticipating that there might be a large turnout and a whole bunch of those ballots don't get used, that the cost of the ballots that were not used would not be reimbursable. Is that what you said?
No, to clarify, the ballots that we print for Election Day, we will get we use a third-party vendor. They will invoice us for what was printed. And so, we would pay that, and then that would be something that would be submitted to the Secretary of State's office for reimbursement through the legislature. So what I was trying to convey with that is something where that's the ballot order is something that we determine over about 30 days, 35 days in advance, and we give that number to our ballot printer, and then they go ahead and they print those ballots. So once we do that, that's something where if the cost is low, if the turnout was low, you gave the number, that's what's printed, that's what we owe the vendor. So that is reimbursed, that amount. It's the vote by mail in which that is something, that information goes on a daily basis for about 35 days to the print vendor, and they're printing based on the information we provide them the previous day. So you're only printing what you need, which is based on the requests, and then therefore, if you have lower use of vote by mail, your overall printing cost for vote by mail is less. But the election day, the pre-printed ballots that go out to the polls, that's a number that's predetermined. The vendor goes, and we are on the hook to pay for that, and that would be reimbursable. That is a reimbursable expense. But it's something where if all of a sudden you had you were able to predict, well, you know what, it's going to be way less depending on what's happening during early in-person voting, that ship has sailed. You can't pull back your order because you need that time in order to get it printed, to pack it, to ship it.
But by the time you have to make that request 30 days before Election Day, you might have a little better feel for the turnout than you do now. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Any other questions for Director Perlotti? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we're going to call back Representative Sweeney. And I'm now going to ask whether any of my colleagues have any further questions for Representative Sweeney. Councilman Gallagher.
Maybe not more of a comment, and I do not pretend to understand the mechanisms of Columbus, nor do I ever want to understand the mechanisms of Columbus, regardless of who's running the show. I've been around too long to see that mishmash. But it would seem reasonable to me, and I think it would be a bipartisan request that, because I'm sure this conversation is going on in 88 counties, which is not only a waste of our time, but a waste of everyone's time. It would seem reasonable to me that if the legislature were to order through legislation, that the boards of elections be made whole for 100% turnout and have the clawback from the state side as opposed to the county side, and the return of the dollars not used back to the state within a reasonable amount of time. I actually think the Secretary of State would probably welcome such a maneuver. And again, I would hope that it would be a bipartisan maneuver. Hopefully you can take that message back to Columbus with you, because quite honestly, this is a little bit embarrassing that we're here discussing pieces and parts of an election, regardless of when it is. We shouldn't be doing that. The money should be there, and if it's not used, should be returned to the state, and they can audit all they wish, and they would audit it, I'm certain. So it may be a solution to a problem. I don't know, but that's how I feel. Thank you.
Well, if I can just comment, Chairman, and to Councilman Gallagher, I completely agree with you, and I, Columbus is a complicated place, and we could be sitting here and there could be no money in the Senate version of the budget. We could have passed this on other pieces of legislation. We looked at other amendments, and for whatever reason, my colleagues decided not to do that. And I think the message should be clear: if the state legislature is forcing a election on our boards of elections, and that costs, that I would hope that my colleagues and Secretary of State will say, whatever it costs, we will pay it. And so, again, after we saw the $15 million and the election officials, which is a completely bipartisan 50-50 Republican-Democrat group, came forward and questioned, if we have to go forward, are we going to have enough money? What do we cut? Do we cut poll workers? Do we cut voter education? I mean, there's real consequences. And so we have heard the Senate president make comments that if that is the case, we will look at doing more. So we're looking at an omnibus amendment, which we are hearing we could see another $5 million this week in Columbus, and that's my hope. But I would encourage, and that's been my message, is we should just tell. We shouldn't have to have me come down here and tell you, the different deadlines. If the state's going to force the counties to have an election, we will pay for it. So unfortunately, I think we have to keep fighting and have that message resonate. But paying for it has been and will continue to be, my hope, a bipartisan issue, because I think the vast majority of people understand that is absolutely absurd that we would make the counties not whole. But we still have to have the discussion, and I appreciate your comments.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I
yes.
just want to say paying for this election is not just the number one issue. We all across this county and across the nation is having issues with hiring staff. We've had problems with hiring people previously for other elections. So there's other considerations to make just than who can fit the bill. It's on our team here has to figure out how we're going to get people to. August is vacation time. I mean, it's just, I'm sure they've heard it from you, but I just wanted to put that on the record. It's not just about cost all the time. Sometimes there's some other issues that have to be considered and looked at. before these decisions are made.
No, and to the chairman, to Councilwoman Conwell, I completely agree. I mean, $15 million is, I mean, that's taxpayer money, and everyone understands the very serious responsibility when we're talking about being entrusted and spending other people's money wisely, but there's also the other costs. And again, this is completely the legislature's fault when we looked at last year of having, I mean, our election officials across the state, I mean, it's heartbreaking. They have not had a break. They cannot go on vacation. Elections don't just happen on election day. It takes months. And we've had our bipartisan election official association, again, it is completely even 50-50 Republican Democrat, have really called into question, given the legislature's continual of having, because we couldn't figure out the maps, we had to run another election with abysmal turnout. Individuals are tired, and it really calls into the question the integrity of making sure, if we keep on this path of not listening to our bipartisan election officials about what they need. People are struggling to get poll workers to come out and work a 13-hour day. So there is, it's a really important part that although $15 million, $20 million is substantive, and we can do a lot of good with that money in other avenues, but at some point, I mean, we've heard this from urban, from rural counties, that they cannot continue on this pathway of just, for I have not really had good justification for I personally do not feel like there's been good justification for the past two, and it comes at an expense of the longevity of having people who want to continue to do very, very important work that truly upholds our democracy. So it's, at some point, we're going to continue to feel these costs outside of monetary value.
For the record, Council President Jones has joined the meeting. Any other questions for the state representative? Director Parfiowitz, if the state were to not provide any money, would the county have to bear all the cost, or would some of it be charged back to the municipalities?
In this case, I believe the general fund would be picking up the tab.
We would have to bear all of it, okay. And do we need this legislation under second reading suspension, or can it go 3 readings?
Probably go 3 readings.
Director?
Say that what we're doing right now, because there's costs that we're incurring for this election. We are using our November budget allocation to pay for these things, and then hopefully with an appropriation, we will reimburse that. So I would recommend the sooner that we can get it passed, we can stop robbing Peter to pay Paul.
Okay, thank you. Anything else? Okay, well, hearing none, I know this is unpleasant, but we have to do it, and we don't know how it's going to turn out. But I'm going to make a motion to favorably recommend Resolution 2023-0156 to the full council with recommendation to leadership to put it on the agenda for second reading suspension.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed say no. The ayes have it, and the legislation is recommended. There is no miscellaneous business. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. We are adjourned.